And good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this week's Shed Adventure. And what are we going to talk about? Well, we're going to talk about the jerry can. I'm going to show you a piece of iconic design, and we'll discuss the various options of why it's known as a jerry can. But let's start off with a bit of history, this little beastie. So, what was there before the jerry can? Well, in the British Army, after the First World War, we were using basically a civilian 2-gallon fuel container, this. They later developed this into the 4-gallon container, this on steroids. Pretty much looked exactly like this. And it had the nickname, had a strange nickname for something that was carrying a vital war supply. It was called a flimsy. Now, why was it called a flimsy? Because, of course, that's exactly what it was. It was a flimsy. It was useless. Some units were reporting in the early stages of the Africa campaign in World War II that they were losing up to 40% of their fuel through leakage and spillage. 40%. That is why the jerry can became a war-winning icon. So what's wrong with this device? Well, it's got this brass nozzle or brass top on it. Nothing wrong with that, really. You only need a spanner or a tool to put it on, tighten it up and loosen it. But when it pours, like all containers, with no way that air can get in, it glugs and it splatters. And you lose a lot just by pouring it out. And secondly, the way it's made. So what you have are these seams round the top and round the bottom. Two main ways they were constructed: either rolled crimped seams, they just roll the metal and crimp it in place, or actually soldered. And I'm thinking these are soldered. So what's the problem? Well, it's a flimsy, all right, and when you start stacking these on top of each other, or when you start dropping them, or when you load 3 or 4 of these into the back of a vehicle and they're getting banged about in the desert, all these corners are exposed, and all these corners take a battering and they start leaking. And as I said, you were losing 40% of your fuel in the early stages of the war. So what happened? Well, around the Second Battle of Benghazi, the Brits stumbled upon a few giant German fuel dumps. And what did they uncover? Well, the most important thing was not the fuel. The most important thing was this beauty, which is what we want to talk about today. The jerry can. Probably been around for 80 plus years now. 80 plus years. And this, which is a War Department, WD, don't know if you can see it down there. So British War Department with the nice War Department arrow there. And I can see War Department 1953. So 53, 45, you know, this thing is 8-9 years produced after the war. I can tell you now, because I know where this came from, this was still being used in active service in the late 70s, early 80s in Germany. You can see by its designation this little removable tag that actually it was a diesel can, and there's probably some still in there. So let's look at this can and just see why I'm describing it as an icon of design. So where did it come from? And where did it get the name jerry can? So let's start off with the name, because that's a bit of fun. So if you do a bit of research, you come up with probably 2 reasonable answers. The first is it's a shortening of the word German. Yeah, the British Army, we all love shortening our names, and but German, Jerry, could well be. The one that I like, and I think just sounds so much like the way we behave in the British Army, was just after or before the First World War, people had outhouses where your toilet was in the garden, so you didn't want to go for a leak during the night, so you had a Po underneath the bed, a nice toilet pot to do a whittle in. And one of these, which had a nice sort of sloped end on it, was called a Jerry. I think that was shortened for Jerry Bowen, but it was called a Jerry. It had a nickname of a Jerry. And halfway through the First World War, the German original hat, the big thing with the pointy spike on top, was replaced by the very famous, now iconic German helmet that we all remember from Second World War movies. And lo and behold, that helmet looked really like the old piss pot that was underneath your bed, called a Jerry. So I think the idea that you want to be derogatory to your enemy, and I think the idea of calling a Jerry with his new piss pot on his head, I think that's the slang version of where the word Jerry came from, why we call Germans Jerrys. I rather like that one. And so therefore, if you've got a can, and the can belongs to the Germans, which it did, because we didn't have these, no surprise, it's suddenly known as a jerry can. And that name has stuck. I don't even think it's considered derogatory. It's such a ubiquitous name now. No one was upset when we would refer to these, in Germany as jerry cans. Probably a, I don't know, Wehrmacht Einheit canister. I'm not sure about my German. Would be the better correct name for it, but it's known the world over as a jerry can, and that's where the name came from. So what's so fantastic about it? So the Germans understood that that they were going to fight a fast, mobile war. We all know about the famous Panzers and all the rest of it, and Blitzkrieg, etc. And they understood that they needed some way of transporting fuel on the vehicles and getting it to the vehicles, that last mile logistics. And what you don't realise is that actually the vast majority of German logistics, even in the Second World War, was horse-drawn. People forget about that. In all the newsreels, in all the films, you don't see horses and carts. You see panzers and you see trucks. Absolute lies. The Germans in World War II had 2.75 million horses pulling carts, pulling wagons, pulling artillery pieces. The only people that had more were the Russians, and they had 3.5 million horses. Amazing. But that's the way it was. So the German logistics was train, lots of rail, train to the railhead, horse and cart, forward. So they needed something they could put in a horse and cart. They needed something that was man-portable. They needed something that they could put on their vehicles. And they put out, before the Second World War, an invitation to tender, an ITT. And they put it out to German industry. And German industry took it up because this was a big tender. They were going to order millions of these. And various designs came back, all sorts of shapes and sizes, squares, rounds, conical. But this came, and I'll point out a number of design features. So the thing is made in two halves. It's made in two halves and joined down the middle. So first thing, there are no seams in the vulnerable corners. Vulnerable corners, bottom, no seams. And it's not crimped. It's not soldered. This is actually welded. So you've got a seam in the middle, and if you can see, the seam is recessed. So this is flat. So there's no exposed seam that can get banged. You can stack these right up against each other, so the vulnerable part, which is always going to be the seam, is actually hidden and protected. It is so simple, but it's so simple, it's brilliant. We couldn't come up with that. The next thing are the handles. You've got 3 handles on the top. Why is that important? Well, if anyone, and I've moved a few thousand of these in my day, wants to know, it's really difficult moving and handing these to people. So if you're on top of a vehicle, you can hand this down and there's a handle there for someone else to pick up. If you're filling these, you can actually hold 4 when they're empty. You can grip another one here on the outside hand, another 2 here, and you can walk across the field quite happily with 4 empty jerry cans. Absolutely no problem whatsoever. If you're pretty tough, 3 of you can walk along with 4 jerry cans. Bloke in the middle holding these 2, and you outside with 1 each. Not very far. These are heavy when they're full. But you pass them down a human chain. If you're stacking these up, you're unloading wagons. You can get a swing going, and you can swing that to the next bloke, and as it comes to him, there's another handle available for him. Or even just putting it down on the ground, and he can pick up that handle that's free. So great bit of design. And lots of people ask me, why is this here? Is this to sort of support the handle? No. It can only fill up to that level, so you've got air in there. So why is there air in there? My understanding, for 2 reasons. One, even when this is fully loaded, with this extra small amount of air, this will become buoyant if you throw it in the water. So a fully laden jerry can, I've never seen it, I've never tried it, so if anyone knows any better, let me know. I'm told it will float. Secondly, when I come on and talk about this genius spout here, it gives you air in there to help you start your initial pour. But there's some clever stuff. So let's have a look at this cap. Really important part of any container. Secure by that catch. Lifts up, but watch this. Something as simple as this. You see that? As you open it, it just drops down there and stays open. So when you've got this heavy thing and you're picking it up and you're trying to get it into your Jeep or your tank or your Panzer, you haven't got this thing falling up and you're trying to put your hand and hold. No, it goes up, and someone just worked out the simplicity of making this an oval, and it just slots in there and locks in place. Iconic design. So simple, but so clever. That's why you would recognise this from the Second World War, and that's why it hasn't changed in 80 years. You can't really make it any better. Now the next thing, I've talked about trying to, with the old tin, taking this lid off and pouring it. First thing you notice, it hasn't got a spout. This actually has a nice lip that delivers you a flow of water. This comes out and it starts glugging, and because it can't get air in there, and petrol is being sprayed everywhere. Difficult to see, but in here, just up there, in the original German jerry can, there was a little pipe that just started there and went back up here, but there is basically a, I don't know, a tube, and you can't see it, that runs back. It's right. I can't find the end of it. That allows you to let air in here. So when you pour this, and it pours out really nicely, a jerry can just pours out perfectly. Air can get back in here, so it doesn't glug. No blup 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 blup. You don't have to bring it back up to let the air in. You can empty this straight in, just pour it out, and the air gets back in through this little bit in here, which I'm struggling to describe, but I don't know if you can see it. Again, just so clever. And just so you know, in here there's a nice little rubber gasket. I've never had to change one, or I've never found a jerry can that leaked. You can stack them up. You can put them on their side. You can do anything with them. Sorry about the dirt. Let's look at this little design here. When you'll see them on all jerry cans. So what's that all about? Number of things. The one obvious one is strength. So just like you get wriggly tin, corrugated iron, corrugations give strength. This adds some strength to these potentially flimsy sides, but look at the difference in strength to this horrible thing, flimsy. Also, it allows it to expand as well. These corrugations gives room for these sides to come out. Why is that important? Well, if you're filling these in Europe and then shipping them to Africa for the African campaign, and they're sat in the desert in blazing sunlight, they are going to get literally red hot, and the fuel can expand in these, and indeed in the winter it can contract, and the tin doesn't split, the tin doesn't suffer, these just slightly bulge out at the side. Yeah, and this one, 1953, been serving its life right through into the 70s and 80s in Germany for the British Army of the Rhine. No large amounts of rust. The inside is fairly clean. Red oxide in ours. What the clever Germans did with their version in the Second World War is they lined it with a sort of plastic rubberized stuff, and they use them as water containers as well. So it became a fuel and water container. We used to put water in these, but of course had no lining, so it got tainted and got rusty and all sorts of things. What was the one great thing about this container? The Benghazi burner. What's that? Well, you take the 4 gallon version, or this one indeed, cut it in half, or in the 2 gallon, just take 2 of them, cut the top or the bottom off to make a tin. Fill one up to there with sand, pour in a gallon of petrol, set light to it, and you've got a flame that will burn away. Use the other half, put in a couple of gallons of water, balance it on top, and lo and behold, you're making tea. And there's nothing more important to a British Army soldier than having a brew. And it was always really encouraged by the British Army for the British soldier, old Tommy, to have a brew. Why? Because I think people know that if you don't boil water, your tea tastes horrendous. So, what do you get by encouraging your soldiers to have a brew? You get them boiling their water. Boiling their water obviously stops things like dysentery and all the other horrors of war. So, the one good thing about the old flimsy was cutting it in half and making yourself a Benghazi burner, a bit of sand with some petrol poured in there. So there we go. Very quick run through this week. I think you've cottoned on. I think this is an amazing piece of design. Great German engineering, great German thinking, and we copied it. And we copied it really after sort of 1940. By 45, when we're looking at the invasion of D-Day, we had made quite literally millions of them. We had factories producing these. The American version was not as good. It had a seam round the top and a seam round the bottom, and it missed this lovely, clever spout. It had the same sort of cap on it that you got on the 50-gallon oil drum. Just not as good, and you needed a spout, and you needed all sort of a spanner to open it, and all sorts of things. Not as popular as this. At some stage, in the early part of Battle of Normandy and D-Day, people were just obviously filling up their tanks, filling up their vehicles, and chucking these away. And it got to a stage where they just weren't getting enough back, and French school children were actually encouraged to go and pick them up and given a couple of cents for bringing back jerry cans that they found lying around the place. They were that important. So it really allowed mobile warfare for the Germans, and it certainly saved our bacon in terms of last mile logistics, D-Day and beyond, and a war-winning solution to moving petrol. 80 years later, still the same design. Outstanding. Brilliant. Well, I hope you like this quick run through on history. If you do, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in a week's time for our next shed adventure. Thank you very much.